right. Well, good morning, folks. That was a wonderful way to kick off the morning, and I'd just like to echo my thanks as well to the team, Kelty and her team at Texas Rural Funders, Kaseng and the team at the Dallas Fed. It's great to be back here and back in Texas as always, including with our partners from the BDO. So for those of you who I haven't met, my name is Kathryn DeWitt. This was a very lovely introduction. And I have been leading the Broadband Access Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trust for the last 8 years. Just to give you a quick overview of the discussion today, I will spend a minute talking to you about why I have any credibility to come into Texas and talk to you all about these, the research that we've done. I'll do a little bit of framing so that way we all have the same context and foundation of concepts for what we're going to discuss today. We'll talk about two of the largest federally funded state programs, the Capital Projects Fund and BEAD. Then we will talk about where we are with BEAD, what those next steps are, but then really why we are all here, which is what comes after for the states. And of course, what does this mean for Texas? I'll leave some time for questions and answers at the end. Actually, as I'm saying that, I'm going to put my phone out and start a little timer for myself. So, all right, let's get into it. So briefly, as I mentioned, I've worked for Pew, and for those of you who are not familiar with Pew, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, fact-based organization. What does that actually mean? What that means is that there are a range of folks like me and my colleague Colby Humphrey, who is here. He's gently waving and is probably mortified that I just called him out like that. Thanks, Colby. Who we focus on a range of issues from state fiscal health and broadband really down to protecting the marshlands and penguins. And we bring data and research to policymakers at every level of government to help improve policy outcomes. Our work started about 8 years ago with a question, which was why billions of taxpayer dollars had been spent on broadband access, yet millions still lacked access. And in that regard, how were states addressing this problem? Because that's really the focus for a lot of Pew's work is at the state level. What were states doing? Was it effective? And as we're thinking about this concept of universal access, meaning that no matter where you are, what your income is, that you can have access to a high-speed, affordable connection. So, is universal access actually achievable? Our research found is that, yes, it is. And that access is more necessary than ever before. Thank you very much for that very succinct warm-up for the exact reason that we found, which was this isn't just about do you have an internet connection or not. This isn't a binary question. This is about economic opportunity. And what federal and state work in recent years have demonstrated is that there is still strong bipartisan commitment to achieving universal access. However, how we get there looks different. Looks different than it did 5 years ago, and it's going to look different 5 years from now. But even with the changes for BEAD, which we'll talk about, BEAD is still our best shot at narrowing the availability gap. We know that BEAD won't fully solve the problems of affordable access and won't address long-term needs. And then finally, we're at the end of an era of significant federal spending. So naturally, the impetus, the momentum, and the leadership is going to shift back to the states. So then the question becomes, what will states do? When we're thinking about our research and our strategic planning at Pew, we're really considering a couple of factors. And there are many factors that shape universal access. These are just 5 of them. But these are 5 important ones. And the first is that it is expensive and there is a lower return on investment in what we call higher cost communities. Higher cost meaning that they are rural, so low density, or they are low income, they have a high prevalence of low income households, or both. So and building on that and the consideration with return on investment is that 90% of internet service in the United States is provided by a private sector company. So when we're thinking about that ROI, we have to bear that in mind because companies have to make a return on investment in order to operate in the long term. The second is that there's no regulation. Internet service is not a regulated utility. I am not calling for internet service to be a regulated utility. What I am saying is that because it is not a regulated utility, there were fewer legal requirements on internet service providers to provide service in certain areas, particularly where they are not guaranteed a return on that investment. So with those two considerations in mind, policy tries to step in and correct these market failures by incentivizing deployment and service costs in these higher cost communities through grants and loans and policy interventions. That still fell short. And public and private investment over time has also increased the availability of broadband, but affordability still remains a challenge. When affordability is still a challenge, that means that your adoption rates, so your customer subscriptions, that remains low. That still complicates the business case that we need in order for ISPs to keep serving these communities. So the final conclusion then that we can take from this is that policy solutions must account for both availability and affordability. So let's talk a little bit about some of the data and research, particularly related to some of the priorities that have been outlined by the BDO and the Texas State Legislature. We talk a lot about consumer usage and then economic impact healthcare. These are also priorities that the BDO and the legislature have outlined, but in particularly related to customer usage, we want to talk about things like reliability and speed. Those things also help increase customer usage, but when we're thinking about the fact that the average speed for consumers, the requests have doubled in a decade. Doubled. So when we're thinking about investing in our networks, when we're thinking about using public dollars in order to invest in those networks, we want to think about how we are building for the future, how networks can support that increased customer demand, which is driven by applications. Now, I will also add that I'm getting ready to talk about agricultural uses, and Brian Whitaker is sitting in the audience, and so I'm generally reluctant to talk about agriculture when Dr. Whitaker is in the room. He is the best of the best, and you'll hear from him soon. But what we know is that two important things about agricultural usage. The first is that those speed needs are increasing. They are also moving towards multimodal applications. So this is fiber to the barn. It's fiber to the dairy barn. I am not the specialist, but then it is wireless out in the fields. So you need that robust fiber connection in order for those agricultural applications to be effective. The other thing that I'll note is that because of the increased investment in fiber and an attention to adoption and affordability in recent years, we have been able to study the impact of fiber and broadband adoption, particularly in rural communities. And research from the Center on Rural Innovation found that communities that have higher rates of adoption in fiber have a higher GDP and a higher growth in small business. Finally, as we're thinking about healthcare and the ever-increasing costs of healthcare, this is where telehealth plays a role. We know that there can be significant cost savings when you adopt telehealth, and of course, fiber is a key piece of that. So, our work on universal access. Our research showed that states were taking a different approach before 2021. And we learned a couple of things. In 2021, I'll come back to in a minute. We learned a couple of things that are important both in Texas and nationally. The first is that states were really zeroing in on 5 things that were setting them apart from federal policy. And what we can summarize this as is a highly centralized approach to broadband universal access. That is, there's a policy framework. They were investing in significant planning activities, data collection and evaluation. They were doing a lot of community engagement to understand what really are the local needs, because this is going to become an increasingly localized problem the more that we move forward. They were dedicating funding to broadband deployment. They had offices with clear authority and oversight of these programs. And then, of course, I do research, so I really like this one, program evaluation and evolution. So, but importantly though, because states obviously have a different fiscal responsibility than the federal government, they have to report back to their legislators. What are they spending? Are they actually meeting those goals? And so there was a very tight relationship between those funding commitments and then the evaluation that states were reporting back. But when we look at this policy framework, there are a lot of policies that you can pursue to increase universal access. But these are the 4 that are the most important, in addition to having a broadband office. And those 4, which I'll go into more detail in later, and we'll talk about in the context of Texas, are dedicated state funding for build-out, requirements that ISPs that are receiving public funds offer affordable options for consumers, You have speed minimums of at least 100 down, 20 up, at least. And then there are preferences for fiber or other scalable technologies that can then keep pace with evolving technology as consumer demands and applications evolve. But really, again, it's ensuring that those public dollars are being invested in networks that can build for the future. What I'll also note, too, is that there is no one-size-fits-all. I'm talking about 4 policies here. These policies don't look exactly the same across all states. States have different approaches to them, which we can talk about. But this is really to provide really those 4 key things that states should keep in mind as they're working towards universal access. So BEAD. BEAD was designed with these specific dynamics in mind, meaning that both federal policy had fallen short, states were taking a different approach. And COVID-19 provided a moment for Congress to think and look differently about the problem at hand. What hadn't been working, wow, that's really small, y'all, I'm sorry. We'll make sure the slides get sent around. It provided another moment for Congress to reassess how could they do this differently? What could this look like when they were perhaps focusing on the states and directing money to the states who had a different understanding, again, of the digital divide. And the leading state programs, including some that we had done research on, provided that alternate route for Congress. And there are 4 things that you really should understand about BEAD that set it apart from other federal programs. And that scale, it's state-centric, and it's this notion of accountability. So this is committing significant funding to actually finish the job. That was what BEAD was designed to do. It was designed to be the last major federal investment in broadband deployment. That's why we committed $42.5 billion to scalable high-speed infrastructure. But it also lowered barriers of entry for ISPs. So rather than keeping some types of providers out or writing programs exclusively for certain providers, it said everyone can be eligible. There's a 4-year construction timeline for BEAD-funded networks, which is significantly faster than most federal programs. And there were affordability requirements that were attached to it. Now, those affordability requirements are still in place, but they look a little bit different now. Again, we'll talk about that in a minute. Finally, there's an emphasis on quality data and on federal coordination. If you have spent 20 minutes at some sort of broadband conference and someone hasn't brought up the data issue, I'm shocked. The data has actually gotten much better in recent years, and by and large, that is the result of the fact that states having more authority to go collect, verify, and improve the quality of federal data that folks are using to actually make decisions today. So, where are we now on BEAD? Sorry, I should have brought some water up here. So, where are we now? Kelsey, it's okay. Oh, thank you. All right, well, thanks. So, in 2021, which was when both the Capital Projects Fund and BEAD were established, 8 million locations in the country lacked access to broadband. That's locations, not people. Today, we're at 5 million. So we've decreased that by about 1/3. That's really remarkable, just in 5 years. But there's still 5 million homes and businesses that lack access. And there are 3 factors that are driving that increase in availability. The first is private capital, which accounts for between 85% and 90% of broadband investment. The second is public policy and funding that was explicitly focused on those high-cost communities that don't offer the immediate business case or are very risky for ISPs. And the third is that better data. It's that better data, both on availability and quality, that allows for a more precise application of funding. Finally, we also know that affordability, while it has gained more attention and we have dedicated some funding to affordability, we know that there is still significant work to do there. And what we've learned, though, importantly about affordability, is that when you have subsidies in place, research from John Horgan that was published last year found that, particularly when we're looking at the Affordable Connectivity Program, those subsidies helped increase subscriptions in rural communities, and they helped stabilize subscriptions in suburban and urban, not rural, suburban and urban communities, meaning we're increasing the customers in rural communities where that density, so you're in every pass, every usage is incredibly important, and you're making sure that the customers in those more densely populated communities are actually staying online. So you're creating certainty for the ISPs. Briefly, I could spend an hour and a half just talking about these 3 points. I want to emphasize just how quickly this transition happened for states. Your Broadband Development Office is, are you guys officially 6 years old yet? 5? You're not even 5. You're 5. 4 and a half? I don't know what day it is. 2021. 2021, great, okay, right. Lots happened in the last 5 years. And what's important is that before capital projects, before the American Rescue Plan Act, states had no role in federal broadband policy. At best, you had states kind of elbowing their way into the table when federal policymakers were making decisions to say, actually, you're overbuilding on a network that we committed funding to last year. So what states did, and what CPF did in particular, was establish coordination between levels of government that had not happened before. And it required that coordination as well. Within that, too, that meant that states, just half of which in 2021 had broadband offices, you had 50% of states establishing brand new broadband offices, rapidly hiring staff, rapidly scaling up to meet significant federal funding requirements, all within, in some cases, in the span of just several months, and then getting ready to spend approximately $55 billion. I'm going to repeat that number, $55 billion. That's capital projects, that's BEAD, that's the Digital Equity Act. So it's important to note that this isn't just a lot of money. What came along with that were more responsibilities for broadband grants administration, for data collection, community engagement, intensive planning, much of which also hadn't been done before comprehensively at the state level. So states are building up all this capacity. At the same time, you have state legislatures that are still continuing to pass laws to accelerate deployment, to remove barriers to deployment, address digital skills and affordability, and in some cases, including Texas, have other broadband grant funds. So when we talk about the increasing role of states, particularly as federal funds are decreasing, we want to talk about the credibility that states have now that they did not have 5 years ago. States are now viewed as credible leaders and thinkers in a highly technical policy area, and they're viewed as pace setters in some respects because they are solving these problems in ways that the federal government has been unable to until now. So, capital projects. I'm spending the rest of my talk focusing on BEAD, but capital projects is a very large program, and as Bryant mentioned yesterday, it is also coming to an end at the end of this year. The end of this calendar year. So they are required by law to fully spend down funds from the Capital Projects Fund, American Rescue Plan Act, by the end of 2026. What's important to know is that capital projects and BEAD are very different programs. People at times can say, oh, they're kind of the same. They're not. Capital projects is a highly flexible program. It was a stimulus program that was designed to get money out the door and moving. So states had, really the requirements for capital projects were focused on improvements to connectivity, device access and digital literacy, and at multi-purpose facilities. So of that approximately $10 billion allocation for CPF, $500 million came to Texas. And that came and really accelerated and supercharged some of the work that was going on in the BDO. So it funded BOOT. This is a small snapshot of what CPF did in Texas. I'm sitting here looking at the BDO, who's probably like, Kathryn, you missed 4 things on here. But the capital projects has funded BOOT. It's funded data collection and mapping, technical assistance to local governments, as well as partnerships with other state agencies. And while some states have taken similar approaches to this, Texas is, what you can see from this is not only taking a stab at deployment, it's also making those foundational investments in the capacity building at the state level and at the local level to ensure that funds are really going where they are most needed. It's developing a comprehensive understanding of what the state's network connectivity needs are and how funding should be used for strategic investment moving forward. In other states, again, we saw similar uses, but we also saw them use things like supplementing existing state programs. So in a state like Minnesota, where they had had a program in place for about a decade, that funding really just helped Minnesota accelerate their deployment efforts and narrow their availability gap quickly. It funded line extension programs, supported deployment in public health, in public housing, libraries and other community centers, and then also some money was directed really for adoption and device uses in those communities as well. So 2025 brought significant changes to BEAD. And I'm happy to take more questions on this at the end. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, not because it's not important, but because we really want to talk about these changes in the context of what it means for Texas moving forward. And as Brian mentioned yesterday, and as I'm sure all of you know, a restructuring policy notice was issued in June of 2025. I want to call attention to a couple of things. The first is that BEAD still remains focused on unserved last mile service, but there is a narrow definition of serviceable locations, which means that some locations, including community anchor institutions, may not be receiving funding to get built out. The affordability requirements were also significantly decreased. So while there is still there's a requirement that affordable offers must be available, the state has less of a role in being able to say, our data tells us this about what our customer or what customers can really afford. Can we talk about how we can make that affordable plan fit the marketplace a little bit better? Additionally, the emphasis, and again, as Brian explained yesterday, the emphasis was on lowest cost offer first. So states went through a lot of negotiation, a lot of math, to, in some cases, say and explain how that lowest cost offer, so the lowest price technology, why that wasn't going to be the right fit. Additionally, non-deployment funds are paused until further notice. We're expecting guidance to be released on March 11th or 12th that should hopefully provide states with some direction on how they can use that non-deployment funding. And importantly, and this is why the state capacity again is really critical, states had 90 days to implement these changes. So we're talking about completely redesigning a grant program that they had been building for roughly 3 years, redesign it, reissue the bids, review the bids, make sure, pick the right locations, and then submit a new proposal to NTIA within 90 days. That's an astounding amount of work. So what does this mean for Texas? I will say, before I say this, we have not published research on this yet. We have not been able to complete our own data analysis on this yet because not all of the data from NTIA is public. So this is based on what information that we have available now and some of the information that's been published by our colleagues at the BDO. So first and foremost, nationally and in Texas, most locations will still receive fiber connections. We did see a dramatic increase in LEO connections across the country, and that will account for roughly 27% of Texas's eligible locations. And there's approximately $21 billion in remaining funds. Those are those non-deployment funds, and that's roughly $2 billion in Texas. I want to be really clear about something before I move on. Non-deployment funds, these leftover funds, are not money that the states are sending back to the federal government. This is not money that they're saying, okay, we're good, you can have it. $2 billion, these non-deployment funds are what are left over from this benefit of the bargain round, from the 90-day changes that they implemented from the June 6th notice. And that's a result of how the funding requirements shifted to those lowest cost offers. So when you hear that $21 billion number in non-deployment funds, that is actually the sum total of these leftover monies across all 56 states and territories. So that's $2 billion in Texas, that's $900 million in Kansas, that's $800 million in Louisiana. Missouri, not Kansas. Okay. Happy to answer questions on that again later too. All right. So earlier, I made a statement that probably irritated some of you, which was that BEAD remains our best tool to increase availability across the country. And we want to talk about that, though, with these changes in mind. So on the left, we have sort of the big takeaways nationally. On the right, it's kind of how that context looks in Texas. And the first is the point that I think is getting lost, which is the majority of locations being served by BEAD are still receiving fiber. We are also dropping from that 5 million number. We are going to be dropping that number down to, honestly, there are a lot of projections out there right now, depending on which one you look to. Some say 1 million, some say it's significantly less than that. Regardless, overall, we are dropping from millions of locations to significantly less than that. We are able to move away from how do we solve this huge availability problem to how are we spending our time and attention focusing on a few discrete areas of need. It allows us to look forward and toward more comprehensive connectivity needs, as well as other needs that need our resources and attention, including digital skills. So additionally, this significantly decreases the state's fiscal commitment to broadband generally. The BDO originally estimated it would take approximately $10 billion to fully connect Texas. So this is $1 billion down. Additionally, BEAD will still primarily serve rural locations, and those have the highest CapEx, as we've discussed. And both rurality and density were cited by the BDO in their 5-year action plan and the state's plan and several other documents as really two of the leading challenges for the state as they think about service availability, quality, and affordability. Additionally, we have, because of the mandated planning and data collection that has gone on throughout the BEAD process and will continue as funding is implemented, we are still going to have a more precise understanding of where broadband is and is not, the location of other network assets, a more precise understanding of that than ever before. And so looking forward, Texas and the BDO and their partners can apply funding in the BIF and from other resources in more strategic ways than they would have been able to in the past. So generally, this is a benefit for Texas, and I don't want to try and gloss over concerns about the changes to BEAD. And I want to repeat that. I am not trying to gloss over the concerns about the changes to this program and what particularly shifting from fiber to other types of technology may or may not mean for some of the constituents that y'all represent. Those concerns are valid. However, with this investment, it means that the state can now move forward in implementation and then again really refocus on state priorities and how the state wants to make sure that those connections are delivered, secured, and sustained in the long run. So, briefly, overview of BEAD implementation. I'm not going to bore you with process. You're welcome. But the goal of this is to emphasize that the work isn't done. So we are just getting to the point of deploying the funding itself. But in order for these funds to be deployed correctly, in order for Texas to stay in compliance with federal law, we are going to need sustained attention and coordination both within the states and then across the states, because there will be some challenges and barriers and learnings that pop up that are specific to Texas, and there are going to be some that are shared across states. So that state-to-state collaboration will be really important to elevating these issues up to Congress and figuring out where national strategies or regional strategies are required in order for the states to keep moving forward on this 4-year construction timeline. The other thing that I want to call attention to is that with the new terms and conditions that states were required to sign as part of their final proposals, there came some new conditions that they had not been expecting when it comes to enforcement. One of those things are permitting shot clocks. Others are some conditions on internet service providers and whether or not they can take future federal funds. These are things that y'all should be aware of, but also from the same standpoint recognize that it's not necessarily within the state's control. So it will be important to understand as you're working through the inevitable challenges of deployment, what is within the state's control and what is a federal action that they themselves are taking on to implement. So if we're setting the table for success with BEAD, there are a couple of things that we want to focus in on. And the first is that BEAD, by law, BEAD-funded networks have to be built within 4 years of receiving funds. That's fast. So that means, again, that you want to make sure that you have a couple of things in mind. Not only understanding what are the terms and conditions that folks are signing up for, what are some of the barriers that states and ISPs anticipate as they implement. Those two leading ones, by the way, are permitting and workforce. We talked about that quite a bit yesterday. But how do you think about landing the plane with BEAD over the next 4 years? And the first is you want to make sure that you need a strong broadband office. So keep your BDO authorized, make sure that they have the authority and the support that they need in order to effectively manage this program. Bryant yesterday put out a call to all of you to engage in those community listening sessions. I can't emphasize that enough. You have a team who is there to be responsive to your needs, who wants to make sure that these programs are a success. If they don't know that there are problems, if they don't know that there's good news, they can't act on either. So the more that you can talk to your BDO and be responsive to some of the things that they say that they need, the more successful this program will be. The other thing that I would recommend is to continue activities that actually both support BEAD and your state priorities. So technical assistance is one of those things. Looking at your middle mile needs is another. Workforce development is a big one. Texas is one of the only states that has dedicated funding to the telecommunications workforce issue. That's good. Keep it up. We talked a bit about responding to emerging risks and barriers, but really a lot of that comes back to communication and isolating what the challenges are, what the specific challenges are. And then consider pursuing some of the efforts that will extend the impact of BEAD and fill in those gaps from federal funds. That's both the Digital Equity Act and non-deployment funding. And when we're thinking again about some of the challenges that the BDO has elevated in recent years and all of their planning documents and goal setting, a lot of that comes back to affordability, adoption, skills, and usage. If we want this to actually have an economic impact on the state writ large, you have to focus on folks actually getting online, being able to stay online, and using those connections for skilling, education, healthcare, and all the myriad uses in general. So what comes after BEAD? This is a little bit of a misnomer because really you shouldn't be planning for after BEAD. It should be going on while BEAD is happening. But really when we're thinking about what does the funding landscape look like, what do priorities look like, there are three things that emerge. The first is thinking about your access gaps. So we know that BEAD isn't going to cover everything. The office is limited by statute in what they can, where they can build, where federal commitments are in place. That's why these technical assistance programs with local government are really important, to figure out where the remaining gaps are and what those gaps should be filled by. The second is recognizing that the federal role will continue to diminish and states will have increasing responsibilities. And this is a natural byproduct of the end of a significant federal spending, but it is understanding what you need to do in order for those federal funds to be, the standards and requirements to be met, for the state to meet those requirements, close it out, and then again, build off of those investments so the state can focus on their priorities moving forward. Finally, on the growing state responsibilities, this isn't just, okay, how is the state thinking about filling gaps? It's also recognizing that Congress is not working particularly effectively right now. So Congress has not passed a major law related to broadband since 2021, since it passed the IIJA. So when we're talking about states and how they have continued passing laws related to broadband, that's notable. Keep doing that. And that's not to say that there's no hope in Congress. My point is that we can't wait on Congress to pass significant legislation, whether we're talking about universal service fund reform, whether we're talking about permanent affordability subsidies or anything else. States have to take on some of that responsibility for themselves and then figure out how that can fit within federal policy structure. So we started with 4 state policies at the beginning, and beyond the point, the obvious one, which is really just 4? Yes, just 4. But the question is also why legislation? That's one that we get a lot, and that's an important distinction. So why legislation versus something that's actually written into into program funding guidance, incentivized via scoring applications. The answer is actually pretty simple, which is legislation and policy. They're a little bit harder to undo. They're a little bit more insulated from political volatility. It also institutionalizes those priorities across government. So instead of it just being a priority of the BDO, whatever the broadband speed is, that's now the broadband speed across the state. So additionally, when we're talking about state policies, I keep talking about how this problem is becoming increasingly localized. States, by nature of being states, are just better positioned to respond to these sort of 1-2 locations that need to be served than the federal government. The policy environment in Texas is not the same as it is in Louisiana. The internet service provider landscape is not the same as it is in Louisiana, nor is the local government. So that's why, as we're thinking about going from 5 million locations to less than 1 million, that's why the state has to play a really leading role in figuring out which solutions will work best for your communities. That's also where all of you come in, to be part of that process, to be part of that discussion, to talk about what your economies need from the perspective of local government, from ISPs, what the business landscape looks like, and how y'all need to remain competitive and profitable moving forward. So, 4 state policies. The first is state infrastructure funding. This means that there is a dedicated state fund in law for broadband deployment and related support. You're going to look up here and be like, wow, 41 states. That's true. There are 41 states that have it right now. However, these all have varying levels of appropriation, and not all states are dedicating state funds to it. Many of them are pushing their federal funds through those state funds at the moment. So this map will probably look a little bit different in a couple of years. But what's important to know is that having a state fund in law with an appropriation means that you have a dedicated source of funding, that stable mechanism to ensure that deployment can continue, you can address upgrades, maintenance as necessary, and other priorities. Affordability. So, talked about this a couple of times, and I think that one of the benefits and learnings of the last couple of years is that our discussion on affordability has evolved a bit. Affordability in broadband policy is not charity, it's good business. Let me repeat that. Affordability in broadband policy is not charity, it is good business. It makes sure that we are sustaining that customer base so those networks can actually deliver the service that in some cases the public sector has provided funding to help them build. But this also means the public sector needs to play a role in ensuring that that service is affordable. And that can take a couple of different forms, which I'll get to in a minute. But it requires a bit of a change in mindset. So anyway, sorry, I'm stumbling a little bit because I'm trying not to jump ahead. I'll get there. Okay. The third is minimum speed floors, and that's speeds of at least 100 down, 20 up. And I say a floor, not a ceiling. So we're talking about speeds that are at a minimum of that 100 down, 20 up, but should go well beyond that. There are going to be many people in the room who say, good Lord, Kathryn, really 100 down, 20 up? Bar feels a little low. I hear you. From the same standpoint, this is higher than it was a few years ago, but more importantly, treat this as a floor, not a ceiling. So as we think about technology continuing to evolve, we want to make sure that the public funds are invested in networks that are useful for contemporary application, which also helps support adoption. So this is why we want to be continually assessing, is this speed minimum sufficient for today's uses, and how do we build above and beyond that? The fourth is prioritizing scalability. So this is that point again of building for future needs. and really thinking about these infrastructure investments as long-term infrastructure investments. These are 30, 50-year investments, particularly when you're talking, well, none of them are really 50 years, but 30-year investments, particularly when you're talking about fiber. Having that scalability requirement in law ensures that not only you're covering yourself with speed, so that's automatically going to be directed to newer technology or technology that has a longer lifespan, but with scalability, that means that you are absolutely investing in those networks and in those connections that have that longer lifespan. It is more expensive at the outset to invest, particularly in fiber, than it is in any other type of technology. When we talk about that $2 billion total in non-deployment funds for Texas, that's why. That's also why we committed $42.5 billion to BEAD. It is because fiber and then all of the other technologies that it can support, particularly advanced wireless, it's more expensive to build at the outset. But what we found in our research dating back to 2018 through 2021 was that state policymakers were committing to scalability in law, committing to fiber in particular, because they felt that it had the best ROI for public dollars. They were treating these like roads and bridges rather than technology. And, the further out you push fiber into the network, the better off all of your wireless is going to work as well. So there's a symbiotic relationship there that I think we don't pay enough attention to. This isn't a one or the other. When we're thinking about universal access, it has to be a combination of technologies. But the more fiber you have in the network, the better off those other technologies are going to operate, including LEO. So let me also just say red is not bad as I'm saying this. But let's do a state-by-state comparison. All right, y'all, I know, I'm getting to the end, I promise. But this is the tally of these 4 policies across states. You'll note that Texas has 3, and that's really the most important thing. But there are several states that have 4. And somebody else said this yesterday, I believe it was Amanda, and I know y'all don't like it when you were compared to California and Colorado. That's all I'm saying. But in general, I also want to point out, too, I've talked a lot about the fact that these 4 policies are not the only policies that can help you on the way to universal access. Just because a state has 0, 2, or 1 doesn't necessarily mean that they are not doing well. It just means that there's opportunity for growth. Louisiana and New Mexico are actually 2 examples of states that have very strong initiatives in their own rights and different priorities. New Mexico, for example, just announced earlier this week that they're funding a telecommunications workforce program. So, in general, though, you really want to come back to, are these 4 policies in place? And, of course, how is Texas doing? So, let's talk about this. Again, I'm reluctant to sit up here and talk about what the state is doing when I am in that state, but we're going to do it anyway just for the group. So, briefly, let's give a quick shot on Texas's approach to universal service. And I have this designed, I keep walking away from the microphone, I'm sorry. This sequence is important because this is the relationship that ideally from a research perspective, which I understand really only helps so far as it actually translates into policy change, but from a research perspective, this is the type of thing you want to see. So you have comprehensive statewide planning that identifies a range of state barriers. These are not all of them, but they are some of them. Then you want to identify the priorities that need to be pursued, the investments that need to be made in order to alleviate those roadblocks. Then your legislative and your executive branches are responding with both policy and funding. So when we're looking at this sequence here, hopefully you can see the evolution of where Texas identified those priorities and made those shifts. So Texas has addressed 3 of the 4. The big one is affordability, and that's the opportunity ahead for Texas. And when we're talking about the importance of affordability in Texas, I want to go back again to the BDO's plans that were drawn from input, probably from a lot of people in this room that represent communities, that represent internet service providers, nonprofits all across the country. Affordability is a challenge for low and fixed income households. So that's low income households, that's those that are aging. 90% of the survey respondents said that they paid $50 or more per month for their home internet bill. That's a lot of money when you are low income, living on a fixed income. And again, population density, which I can't overemphasize, really does pose a challenge for affordability. What I am not doing is making a soft pitch for rate regulation. What I am saying is that without addressing affordability, the state is going to have perennial challenges, both in improving the network availability, the reliability, and the longevity, and seeing that then translate into economic outcomes that everyone agrees is a shared priority for the state and a necessity for the state to remain competitive in the future. So when we talk about approaches to affordability, I promised you there is no one-size-fits-all, and in this case, there is not. So there are three leading approaches. The first is a requirement for a low-cost plan that caps the price at a certain amount. New York is the leading example here. Connecticut actually just passed a law in 2025 that is similar but not the same to New York's, which is more closely aligned to any ISP that is contracting with the state that includes grants, must offer service plans at $40 or less to eligible households. So again, that's the private sector relationship. You're also seeing that that affordability requirement is only available to certain households that meet the defined thresholds. The second is reforming universal service programs, the state universal service programs, to include broadband and the service subsidies that they provide to low-income households. So that's a two-step here, right? So the first is making sure your universal service program actually includes broadband. The second is then increasing that benefit to actually cover broadband costs. Oregon passed a law also in 2025 that reforming their universal service to support broadband deployment, and the requirements around that, or not broadband deployment, affordability, the requirements around that actually look very similar to the Affordable Connectivity Program. And then the last one is a direct subsidy to consumers similar to the Affordable Connectivity Program. We have not seen states themselves establish a program like that with state funds. Instead, what we have seen, including in Maryland and South Carolina, are using one-time sources of federal funds to offset the cost of monthly broadband subscriptions. So looking forward, there are a couple of things that the state will, a few opportunities for the state itself, but really there are two priorities in the immediate. And the first is making sure that BEAD is implemented, again, according to federal law. The second is then refocusing attention on state-identified priorities for universal access. So as you're looking forward, both as BEAD implements and as you start thinking, okay, how do we refocus our attention on Texas and Texas's needs, not necessarily Texas's needs defined within federal law, how are you considering filling in those gaps in availability or quality? How are you thinking about upgrading potential locations that maybe didn't get the service that they wanted? Again, some of that is statutorial, which we could talk about. You currently have speed and scalability standards, but do those need to be addressed? Do they need to be increased? Could they be adjusted? How can they be adjusted to evolve alongside technology? And I recognize there's a tension there, right? Because policy really can't maintain pace with technological change, but you want to have those standards in place so that way there is some sort of parity in that evolving as it goes. Thank you. Some of this, too, is thinking about your growing population. Texas's population continues to grow. With that will be new builds, folks moving into the state. So how are you thinking about ensuring that that access is available and affordable to them once they're in the state? And then finally, digital skills. There is a very tight alignment between broadband access, digital skilling, and state goals and economic opportunity, access to healthcare, education, and really just staying competitive in today's economy. So thank you very much for your time this morning. I'm happy if do I still have time to take a couple of questions? No? Yes? Okay, great. I'm happy to take a couple of questions. I also know that I just ran through a lot of information first thing in the morning. But thank you for your time and welcoming me back to Texas, and hopefully this will be the first of a few opportunities. So, thank you. anyone has any questions, otherwise I will be around for, oh, yes, okay.
Hello, is that better? Okay, wonderful. Kathryn Krantz, Communities Unlimited. I just want to say that I really appreciate you acknowledging that despite the challenges of BEAD, it is still our best hope. And I think that one thing that we missed in all of the frustrations in BEAD and that led up to the changes that were made is the amazing opportunity it was, because it was the only broadband program ever that ever set universal connectivity as the goal. And the work that's been done over the last 3 years has already been generationally transformative, and the money hasn't even rolled out. And I think a lot of that has to do with the time and effort put by state broadband offices and all the hard work they've done. They were tasked with identifying the problem, putting a price tag on it, creating strategies that would solve it. And I think that we are seeing some dramatic improvements. But goes without saying, as a rural advocate, we're really disappointed to lose that money. And my question, and I know you don't have the tea leaves, but you seem to be really connected on the policy level. Do you anticipate people understanding the true cost of taking away billions of dollars of critical infrastructure investment in rural communities? And I know that there are policymakers that want to believe they can pay a lot of money and never have to do it again. Do you see that shifting or changing? Or are people understanding that these are things that they're going to have to continually invest in over time?
That's a great question. And there is not an easy or direct answer, unfortunately. There are two things that I want to point out. I think first is the difference in conversation on that particular point on what does this long-term commitment look like? There's a different conversation happening at the state level than what we see in Congress. And again, I don't mean to knock Congress, that's not my intent. They're focused on different things. But I think that the state legislators feel this challenge more acutely than members in Congress. And so what has been interesting over the last couple of years is to hear, particularly from state legislators who are unhappy and angry about some of these changes because of what it will mean for the rural communities in particular. Now, in some cases, that is spurring additional conversation among state legislators on, okay, so we're gonna take this problem ourselves and handle it that way. At a more macro level, though, I do think that the understanding that this is not like just a box that we can check and move on, I think that understanding is evolving, and I think that the changes in June are a key piece of that, because more research has come out, more will continue to come out, particularly around the public investment in alternative technologies. And that's not to say that LEO isn't a good investment, that's not to say that wireless isn't a good investment, that's not to say that fiber is the absolute best investment. Instead of taking a more nuanced approach and analysis to what does it mean on the front end for us to invest in technology A, B, or C? What does that mean for us in 5 years? What are the commitments on the state, when that equipment breaks down, when we need to replace it? What does our commitment look like then in 10, 20 years after that? So I'm not trying to intentionally I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I think that the conversation is evolving. I think it also is where it will be really important to work closely with partners in state and local government to have those very hard conversations around the fiscal commitments to those upgrades and maintenance in the long term. From the economic impact perspective, there are a lot of really smart economists in this room who can give you a better answer on that, but I think that we are much more attuned to what it means to not have reliable internet in the home and the ability to use it. We are much more attuned to that than we were 5 years ago, but we still haven't really figured out the right way to legislate for it. And the Digital Equity Act would have been a great step forward, and unfortunately that program no longer exists. But hopefully we'll be able to take a lot of that great learning that was done through that program and work with the states on figuring out how to implement what they can.
Well, that sounds very hopeful, and it's appreciated, because that's one of my biggest fears is that they'll check the box, oh, rural broadband's done, and then they'll move on and we'll be back where we were. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Keep your foot on the gas. Keep up the pressure.
I just wanted to ask if you would re-clarify your statement regarding the $2 billion that was held back on the BEAD program. I didn't quite catch the reasoning or the intent or future of that.
Absolutely. So each state was in June of, or not June, it was 2022, 2023, was allocated a certain amount of money from that $42 billion total. Texas's amount from that was roughly $3.3 billion. That was primarily for the use, and the intended use of that, your BEAD allocation, was for connecting every unserved, underserved, eligible location in a state. If at the end of that process, and this is per statute, if at the end of that process there were leftover funds available, those are what are called non-deployment funds. And states, by law, are allowed to use those funds for a range of activities, including adoption, digital skilling, but really it was up to the purview of the state to decide how they wanted to use those leftover dollars. Some states were, before the June 6th policy notice, it was just over a dozen states that anticipated having leftover funds. After that June policy notice, which importantly redirected attention on BEAD to the lowest cost technology overwhelmingly, rather than the emphasis on fiber that had been the pre-June 6th notice. After that, a lot more states had leftover funding. So once they were considered served, they had mapped out all of their served locations. More states had that leftover money, and in the case of Texas, it's roughly $2.2 billion. And now the question is whether or not the state will be able to use the full total of their allocation that was committed to them several years ago, and if so, under what conditions from the federal government. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and really deciding this future $2 billion.
No, it's the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, that's NTIA. That's the entity within the Department of Commerce that's administering BEAD. So technically, the state was allowed to put forward proposed uses for those non-deployment funds, but in June, NTIA paused all use and planning of those non-deployment funds and said that the NTIA would reissue guidance at a later date. We are expecting that guidance to come out next month, and hopefully that will define both what states, well, A, if states are allowed to use it, and B, how they are allowed to use it and when. And at this point, we don't have any indication as to sort of what those categories of use will be. But primarily what we're hearing from across states is that they're advocating for uses in just to alleviate barriers to broadband deployment, things like permitting, workforce, or in things like adoption and skilling programs. But the point that I wanted to bring home was that in some cases it's being reported as states just sending that surplus back to the federal government. And that's not what's happening. It's actually the state waiting for guidance from the federal government to use the remaining allocation that was committed to them several years ago. Thank you very much.
Oh.